The Flaxboro Women's Institute coffee morning had never aspired to excitement. Its most vigorous controversy of recent years involved whether custard creams should be arranged in concentric circles or a more liberated scatter. Thus, when Mrs. Brenda Hopple, treasurer and therefore self-appointed adjudicator of all matters relating to refreshments, lifted the heavy porcelain cream jug and found it strangely heavier than usual, she assumed the milkman had been overgenerous for once. A moment later, she grunted in a manner that suggested both displeasure and surprise. The cream jug did not slosh. It thudded. She tipped it toward the light, intending to inspect for congealed clots, and instead released a short, damp squeak that might have been mistaken for the call of an upset guinea pig. What stared back at her from the bottom of the jug was not dairy, but a small, grayish human ear not freshly detached, but certainly real, and most discourteously placed among the morning condiments. Mrs. Hopple froze between propriety and horror. Propriety won first. She set the jug down carefully so as not to chip the glaze. Horror arrived only afterward, in smaller, more digestible installments, each one expanding her eyes slightly more. Across the hall, Miss Ivy Peet, who prided herself on sensing trouble before anyone else, saw Mrs. Hopple's expression and promptly assumed that the biscuits had not been arranged correctly. She marched over. "What's the matter now, Brenda? Don't tell me the bourbons are chipped." Mrs. Hopple shook her head faintly. There appears to be an item in the cream jug." Miss Peet leaned over. Her lips thinned. "Well, that is most irregular." The two women stood silently for several seconds, each calculating whether summoning help would cause more scandal than leaving the ear where it was. Meanwhile, as news tends to in Flaxboro, the incident had already begun its stealthy migration. First to Mrs. Fenning, who overheard ear in the jug as earwig in the jam, which she judged unremarkable. Then to Mrs. Gedge, who interpreted the rumor as air in the drug, and wondered which family was about to inherit what. By the time the vicar's wife heard it, the town was already silently, politely preparing for a minor uproar. Back at the cream table, Mrs. Hopple lifted her chin. "I suppose," she said with grim resignation, "we must tell someone. Someone respectable," Miss Peet added. "Someone discreet." Both women said the next part together, as though it were obvious. Inspector Purbright. Inspector Walter Purbright was, at that very moment, finishing his mid-morning tea in the station office. He sipped without rush, reading a memo from the Borough Council regarding the unacceptable proliferation of unlicensed flower stalls. It was the sort of civic emergency Flaxboro excelled at. He was halfway down the page when Sergeant Love blew into the room like a well-meaning draft. "Sir," Love said, his face showing in earnest, confusion rarely absent for long, "the Women's Institute has requested your presence. Something about cream, and a jug, and, anatomy." Purbright set down his cup. He allowed himself a small sigh, not of irritation, but of anticipation. In Flaxboro, the smaller the disturbance sounded, the more curious it usually turned out to be. "Did they specify what form this anatomy took?" he asked mildly. Love consulted his notebook where he had written "jug situation" in oversized, defensive letters. "Not precisely, sir, but Mrs. Hopple said it was unsuitable for refreshments." Purbright stood, straightened his jacket, and collected his hat. "Very well, Love. Let's not keep the ladies waiting. They will only worsen the story the longer they are left to its custody." The Women's Institute Hall greeted him with a mingled sense of sponge cake, damp coats, and flustered indignation. Mrs. Hopple met him at the door like someone presenting a moral tragedy. "Inspector," she said, "I feel it prudent to warn you that the contents of our cream jug are not fit for public consumption." Purbright regarded her with calm patience. "Most things brought to my attention these days aren't. May I see it?" She lifted the jug as though it contained something venomous. Purbright leaned in. His eyes, thoughtful and mildly regretful, absorbed the sight. "A human ear," he murmured. "Left side. Adult. Male." He paused politely. Not the sort of garnish one expects at a coffee morning. The ladies leaned back in a collective flutter, uncertain whether to be horrified or quietly pleased at their event's sudden upgrade in significance. Purbright continued almost conversationally. "Has anyone reported an incomplete gentleman recently?" Mrs. Fenning gasped. Mrs. Gedge muttered that she had always suspected something about the new man at the post office. Miss Peet declared that Flaxboro had been going downhill ever since decimalization. Purbright gave a small, courteous nod. "Thank you. I shall make a few inquiries." As he turned to leave, the cream jug secure in Sergeant Love's slightly unsteady hands, Purbright felt with the calm, inward certainty that had guided many of his cases that this was not simply a prank or an unfortunate accident. The ear belonged to someone who had been most improperly relieved of it, and in Flaxboro, impropriety always had a motive. Inspector Purbright's departure from the Women's Institute Hall was met with the sort of reverent hush usually reserved for funeral processions. Behind him, a dozen ladies leaned collectively toward the closing door, as though proximity alone might grant them privileged access to the inner mechanics of a police investigation. But once he and Sergeant Love had stepped onto the chilly pavement of Flaxboro High Street, the hush dissolved at once into a flurry of animated, contradictory chatter. By the time Purbright and Love reached the police car, the town's rumor machinery had already gained 3 embellishments. The ear belonged to a foreign spy. The ear was actually a cleverly carved potato, and the ear had been discovered attached to the remainder of a head that Mrs. Hopple had neglected to mention in her delicate state. Purbright did not hear these attributions directly, but he didn't need to. One became accustomed in Flaxboro to the velocity and elasticity of gossip. The morning traffic was light, consisting mostly of delivery vans making their habitual slow progress, and one elderly cyclist who wobbled unpredictably and seemed propelled forward primarily by offended dignity. Purbright watched the street as Love arranged the cream jug carefully on the back seat, propped in a cardboard box he'd commandeered from the W.I. cake stall. "Sir," Love said, climbing into the driver's seat and fastening his belt with unnecessary care. "Do you think it's genuine?" "The ear." Purbright settled in beside him. "It appeared genuine, but we shall let Dr. Glendinning confirm it in case Flaxboro has lately been overrun by leather craftsmen producing remarkably realistic anatomical novelties." Love nodded, though his expression remained one of faint bewilderment. "It's just, well, sir, you don't often see ears in things. At least not in refreshments." Purbright folded his hands in his lap. "Indeed. Yet we should not assume the oddity of its placement is the oddest part. The question is not why it was in the cream jug, but why it was detached in the first place." Love gave a low whistle and started the engine. The short drive to the station passed through the heart of Flaxboro, where Purbright observed the usual morning tableau. Shopkeepers sweeping their thresholds with performative vigor. Pensioners conducting long, accusatory appraisals of fruit displayed in the greengrocer's window. A dog tied outside the butcher's shop staring resentfully inside as though the sausages hung. There were personal insults. It was all ordinary enough, yet Purbright felt a subtle shift beneath it, a faint current of unease, like a draft under a closed door. The town had sniffed scandal, and scandal in Flaxboro was both feared and relished. At the station, Purbright carried the box to Dr. Glendining's room. The police surgeon looked up from his newspaper with the air of a man interrupted during his most absorbing intellectual pursuit. "Morning, Walter," Glendinning said. "You've the look of someone bringing me something unpleasant." "I'm afraid so," Purbright replied, placing the box on the examination table. "From the Women's Institute refreshments?" Glendinning peered in. My word, he murmured. Then, with clinical briskness, yes, a human error. Male, likely middle-aged. Removed some hours before it entered the jug. Clean severance, professionally done. Professionally, Purbright asked. Glendinning nodded. Not the work of someone stabbing about blindly with the nearest kitchen implement. No jagged tearing, sharp blade. Possibly surgical. Purbright absorbed this quietly. Thank you, Doctor. Please do what further tests you can. I shall require confirmation of the approximate time it was removed and any distinguishing features. Glendinning nodded. Very well. Come back this afternoon. I might have more then. Purbright left him and returned to the main office, where Love was dutifully consulting a map pinned to the wall and frowning as though topography itself had personally offended him. We've had 3 calls already, sir, Love said as Purbright approached. One woman says she thinks the ear belonged to her husband because he never listened to her anyway, though she admitted he was, as far as she knew, still alive. Another caller claimed she'd heard a scream behind the co-op last night, but confessed it might have been a cat dispute. And Mrs. Gedge insists this is connected to the strange man she saw buying 2 tins of anchovies on Tuesday. Purbright inhaled slowly. Anchovies? She said no respectable person buys more than 1. Purbright let the remark settle. It was not entirely incorrect. He glanced at the clock. It was approaching noon, and he knew that the town, having spent the morning fermenting a story, would soon begin peppering the afternoon with reinforcements. Information, misinformation, sightings, non-sightings, speculative connections, accusations disguised as concerns, concerns disguised as accusations. Flaxboro excelled at these. Love, Purbright said, we shall begin by speaking with the staff and volunteers of the Women's Institute. Someone there must have been responsible for setting out the refreshments last night or early this morning. The jug did not walk to the table by itself. Love nodded, grateful for a tangible task. They began with Mrs. Hopple, who answered questions with the stiff precision of someone assembling an audit. She had arrived at the hall at 8:30, unlocked the door, set out the tables, and inspected the cream jug, empty at the time. Miss Pete had arrived shortly thereafter, and the 2 of them had prepared the refreshments together. Neither had noticed anything amiss, other than Miss Pete's insistence that the lemon slices be displayed at a more optimistic angle. Purbright listened patiently, coaxing details with gentle prompts. He was particularly interested in the hours before the meeting, when the hall had been empty. Mrs. Hopple admitted that the hall had been used the previous evening by the Amateur Dramatic Society, who had left at approximately 10. She did not possess the vocabulary to describe their behavior, but her tone made it clear that she considered theatrical people one small step down from arsonists. Purbright made a note. Did anyone else have access to the hall? Only Mrs. Tegg and her key, Mrs. Hopple said. She's the caretaker. But she wouldn't do anything like this. She's Methodist. Purbright allowed this theological assessment to pass unchallenged. He and Love walked through the hall itself, noting the arrangement of tables, the placement of the refreshments, the proximity of the cream jug to the back door. The back door bore faint smudges, mud or dust, not fresh but not ancient either. Love, Purbright said quietly, would you mind fetching the log from the Amateur Dramatic Society's booking? I'd like to know who was here last night. Love set off with the squared shoulders of a man entrusted with meaningful purpose. Purbright remained in the hall, studying the back door again. It was not unusual for actors to come and go with props, costumes, and improbable quantities of emotional turmoil, but ear-severing struck him as substantially outside their usual repertoire. He turned toward the refreshments table again. Something else struck him. The jug had been placed slightly off-center, not aligned with the other items. Mrs. Hopple was too meticulous for that, which meant either the jug had been moved after she set it down, or someone had placed something inside it afterward and nudged it into that position. A small detail, but Purbright had long learned that Flaxboro's oddest incidents were like knitted scarves. Pull one thread, and the entire pattern eventually rearranged itself. He stepped outside into the crisp noon air and observed the narrow alley that ran behind the hall. The ground was soft from last night's rain. There were footprints, several, in fact, though blurred and overlapping. Yet one stood out, a sharper print, perhaps more recent, with an angled sole pattern he did not immediately recognize. Not the sort of shoes elderly WI members favored, more likely a man's. He crouched to inspect it, noting the size and direction. Whoever made it had walked toward the back door. Love hurried back from the station, slightly breathless. "Sir, I've got the names of the Amateur Dramatic Society members present last night. And there's something else the hall log says they finished rehearsal early. But one name is marked as staying behind to collect forgotten property." Purbright raised an eyebrow. "And that name is Harold Pym," Love said, "the society's stage manager." Purbright nodded slowly. He recalled Pym, a diligent man with an anxious manner, fond of tidiness to an almost moral degree. "Very well," Purbright said. "Let's pay Mr. Pym a visit." He glanced once more at the alley, at the faint print pointing toward the hall, and allowed a quiet certainty to settle in. Flaxboro had begun one of its little misadventures, and this time someone's ear had been the opening note. Harold Pym lived in a narrow terraced house on Brisket Lane, the sort of dwelling that looked as though it had been built by someone who distrusted both windows and cheerful colors. The curtains were drawn despite the midday light, and a milk bottle stood outside the door with the same forlorn patience as a dog that had been promised a walk 2 days earlier. Purbright and Sergeant Love approached without hurry, the quiet street amplifying the small, steady sounds of their steps. Purbright knocked lightly. A pause followed, then another. He knocked again, firmer this time. At last, the door opened a few cautious inches, and Harold Pym's pale, bespectacled face appeared like a startled barn owl peering from its nest. "Oh," Pym said, blinking rapidly. "Inspector Purbright." "Huh? To what do I owe the pleasure?" "Mr. Pym," Purbright said gently, "might we step inside for a word? It concerns your rehearsal at the Women's Institute Hall last night." Pym hesitated. His eyes darted sideways, as if seeking confirmation from some invisible consultant. After an awkward interval, he opened the door fully and stepped aside. The interior was neat. Excessively neat. The hallway rug was aligned with ruler-straight precision, shoes arranged according to size and possibly moral standing, and an umbrella rack that had clearly never tolerated disorder. Pym ushered them into a living room decorated in shades of beige that suggested he feared color might corrupt the upholstery. Purbright waited until the man settled into an armchair before speaking. "We understand you remained at the WI Hall after rehearsal," he said. "The booking log notes you stayed behind to collect forgotten property." Pym swallowed hard. "Yes. Well, someone had left a scarf. At least I thought someone had. It turned out it was mine. An old thing. Brown, frayed. I can fetch it if you wish." "That won't be necessary," Purbright replied. "While you were there, did you notice anyone else enter the hall? Or the back door being used?" "No," Pym said quickly, too quickly. "Well, I might have heard something. A sound. But I thought it was just the frame settling. Those old buildings do that, you know. Settle. Did this settling?" Purbright asked. "Sound like footsteps?" Pym's eyes widened. He adjusted his glasses with a trembling hand. I suppose it might have been footsteps, but I didn't look. I didn't think it important." Love stood behind Purbright, watching Pym with an earnest but faintly puzzled expression, as though trying to determine whether the man was nervous because of guilt or simply because he was alive. Purbright leaned forward slightly. Mr. Pym, the Women's Institute, discovered something unusual in the cream jug this morning. Something that appears to have been placed there sometime between your rehearsal last night and the early hours of this morning. We are trying to determine who might have had access to the hall. Pym visibly shrank into his chair. I didn't put anything in any jug, he said, his voice rising with panic. I don't even like cream. I prefer my tea black. We're not accusing you, Purbright said, his tone calm and reassuring. We are simply trying to reconstruct the timeline. Did you, for instance, notice whether the back door was locked when you left? Pym shook his head. I went out the front. I didn't check the back door. It's not my responsibility. Purbright studied him for several long seconds. It was clear Pym was genuinely unsettled, but whether by guilt or by the simple fact of being questioned was harder to determine. Eventually, the inspector rose to his feet. Thank you, Mr. Pym. If you recall anything further, however trivial, please telephone the station immediately. Pym nodded vigorously. Of course. Of course. As Purbright and Love stepped outside, Love whispered, Do you think he's hiding something, sir? Purbright considered this while examining the quiet street. Possibly. But nervousness in Flaxboro is not evidence. It is a way of life. They returned to the car. Love, still uncertain, asked, Where to now, sir? Purbright tapped his fingers lightly on the roof while thinking. The Amateur Dramatic Society. If Mr. Pym stayed behind after they left, we should determine who departed just before him and whether anyone had reason to linger near the back door. The Society was rehearsing their next production, a murder mystery with the improbable title Death Comes Calling for Daphne. They had rented the back room of the Mercury Arms pub for their lunchtime read-through. When Purbright and Love arrived, they found the group in full theatrical disarray, scripts fluttering, chairs scraping, and one actor practicing a melodramatic feint with such enthusiasm that he threatened to topple a table. At their entrance, the room fell into a hush. Mrs. Elspeth Harbottle, chair of the society, stepped forward with the authoritative poise of a woman who believed community theatre was all that stood between civilization and collapse. Inspector Purbright, she said. How may we assist? Purbright explained with his characteristic politeness that he wished to clarify the timing of last night's rehearsal. Harbottle listened with solemn interest, though her eyes flicked repeatedly toward Love's police notebook with an intensity usually reserved for overdue invoices. We left the hall around 10 o'clock, she said. All of us. Except for Harold, who stayed to collect his scarf. He misplaced it again, you know. Always misplacing something. A few members nodded with the vague smugness of people who never misplace anything themselves. Was anyone lingering near the back? Purbright asked. Anyone taking a smoke break, fetching props, or returning to the hall after leaving? A man in his 40s, wearing a tweed jacket and a mustache that seemed to predate him, raised a hand. That would be me, Inspector, he said. Crispin Meldrum. I stepped out the back door for a cigarette during rehearsal. The acoustics in that room are dreadful when people insist on shouting, and I needed air, but I left before everyone else around 9:30. Did you notice anyone else in the alley? No, he frowned, although I did hear a van engine starting nearby. One of those small delivery types, but I didn't see it. Purbright nodded. Was the back door locked when you returned inside? Meldrum hesitated. I don't recall. I believe it was ajar, actually. Just slightly. A ripple of murmurs passed through the group. Purbright studied the man with interest. Thank you, he said. If you think of anything further, anyone you saw, any sound you heard, please contact me. As they took their leave, Love whispered, Sir, do you think the van is important? Quite possibly. Vans tend to be involved in mischief professionally or otherwise. They returned to the station, where a message awaited from Dr. Glendinning. Purbright read it carefully. The ear belonged to a man likely aged between 40 and 60, removed less than 24 hours before discovery. No infection, no injury around the surrounding tissue, suggesting the severing was the first notable harm done. Love watched him read. "Sir," Purbright folded the message, "we now know the ear was removed recently, and cleanly. Whoever did it was not improvising." Love frowned. "So not an accident?" "No," Purbright said quietly. "Nor a spontaneous quarrel. More likely something planned." He sat at his desk, contemplating the facts. A back door left ajar, a van outside the hall, Harold Pym lingering nervously, an ear removed with precision, and a cream jug poorly shifted from its usual position. These were pieces of a puzzle, but not yet enough to reveal the image. "Sir," Love ventured. "What next?" Purbright looked up with mild determination. "We must determine whose ear it is." A silence settled. "Someone is missing," he added, "or soon will be." Love blinked. "Should we start with the usual troublemakers?" Purbright offered a rare smile. "In Flaxboro, trouble is rarely made by those we expect." "No, Love begin by checking for anyone recently absent from work. Anyone who has not opened their shop. Anyone whose neighbors have noticed unusual quiet. We are looking for the absence of noise." As Love hurried out, Purbright leaned back, allowing his mind to sift through the details. Flaxboro's outward calm was a facade. Beneath it lay envy, secrets, and grievances old enough to vote. Somewhere in that tapestry was a man missing an ear and a reason for it, and Purbright intended to find both. Inspector Purbright spent the next half-hour reviewing Love's preliminary reports, which trickled in with the same unpredictable rhythm as a dripping tap. Love was diligent but not quick, and every few minutes he returned to the office with another scrap of information, each one delivered with the earnest gravity of a man bearing crucial intelligence, even when the information involved nothing more than a shopkeeper's complaint about her neighbor's noisy budgerigar. But slowly, patterns began to form. A handful of residents had indeed failed to appear in their usual places of business that morning. Some absences were explained by minor illness or unannounced outings. Others were thinner excuses, and Purbright made note of them. Still, only one name continued to appear in unrelated conversations. Gerald Burroughs, a man of 45, an antiques dealer of moderate reputation and immoderate eccentricity, known to be diligent in opening his shop daily except Sundays. Today, however, Burroughs's shop remained shut. His blinds were down, and, according to a neighbor, his car had not moved since the previous evening. Purbright felt a soft click of alignment in his thoughts. He decided to visit the shop himself. The premises of Burroughs and Curios occupied an old, lopsided building on Wharf Street. Its window display a melancholy arrangement of tarnished silver spoons, threadbare Persian rugs, and one decorative item so dusty that only the vague suggestion of an urn beneath the grey could be inferred, had not changed in months. The sign above the door hung askew, not from neglect, but from the building's natural inclination to list in that direction. Purbright and Love approached quietly. The street was still and slightly damp with the scent of recent rain. Purbright tried the door. Locked. Love cupped his hands to peer through the narrow gap in the curtains. "Can't see much, sir. Looks dark and cluttered." Purbright considered for a moment, then knocked firmly. No response. He waited, then knocked again. Still silence. "Sir?" Love asked gently. "Do you think?" Purbright nodded once. "We should check the residence." Burroughs lived in a small flat above the shop, accessible by an external staircase that looked as though it had survived several wars, despite being built only 30 years prior. The steps creaked loudly under Love's weight, though they remained eerily silent for Purbright, a fact Love found both impressive and slightly unsettling. At the top, Purbright knocked on the flat door. No answer. He tried the handle. Locked. Love shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, if he's hurt, or worse." "Yes," Purbright said quietly. "We shall have to enter." He produced a small tool from his coat pocket, not quite standard police equipment, but not entirely forbidden either, and deftly encouraged the lock to yield. It obliged with a reluctant click. Inside, the flat smelled faintly of stale tobacco and unopened windows. The air was close, and the single lamp left burning cast a weak glow over a room that had not benefited from tidiness in quite some time. Newspapers were stacked haphazardly, cushions bore the imprint of overuse, and a coat lay draped across a chair as though discarded by someone in a hurry or in distress. "Burrows?" Purbright called softly, not expecting an answer. Silence settled across the room like a damp cloth. There was no sign of the antiques dealer in the living room or the kitchen. In the hallway, the closed bedroom door felt heavier than a simple piece of wood should. Purbright approached it with quiet caution and knocked once. No reply. Love swallowed audibly. "Should I, stand back, sir?" "Only if you feel the need," Purbright said mildly. He opened the door. The bedroom was dim but tidy, surprisingly so compared to the living room. A bed made with hotel, like precision, stood beneath the window. A chest of drawers sat neatly against the wall. Nothing seemed out of place until Purbright's gaze reached the writing desk. Upon it lay an assortment of objects: a lamp, a notebook, a fountain pen, a stack of letters tied with string, and a small pale stain on the desktop near the edge. Purbright approached, lowering his face slightly. Blood. A faint smear, barely noticeable unless one looked for it. Love pointed at it. "Sir." "That's yes," Purbright said, "but not fresh, and not abundant." He continued scanning the room until something else caught his attention. A shoe. One shoe. A brown leather brogue, lying near the foot of the bed. No sign of its pair. "Odd," he murmured. Love frowned. "People do kick off shoes randomly, don't they?" "Not Gerald Burrows," Purbright replied. "He was known to polish his shoes nightly and store them together. A man with compulsions rarely abandons them suddenly." Purbright opened the wardrobe. There were clothes, neatly hung, but a gap among the coats suggested one was missing. A suitcase space appeared empty too. "He may have left in a hurry," Love said. "Or been taken in a hurry," Purbright corrected softly. A knock sounded suddenly from the flat door. Love jumped. Purbright turned calmly. "Stay here," he murmured. Purbright walked to the door and opened it to find Mrs. Agnes Twigg, the neighbor from below, holding a tray of tea with the authoritative air of someone who had decided she was about to be helpful and would not be contradicted. "Oh, Inspector, I heard someone upstairs and assumed it must be you. Thought you might need a warm drink while you investigate whatever's happened to Mr. Burrows. I knew something was amiss when he didn't come down this morning. He's very particular about his morning routine, you know. Up at 7, kettle on at 7:14, blinds raised by 7:17 precisely." Purbright accepted the tray with a nod of thanks. "Mrs. Twigg, have you noticed anything unusual last night? Visitors, noises, a vehicle stopping outside?" She pursed her lips thoughtfully. "Well, I did hear something. Around 11. A sort of thud. And voices. Not Mr. Burrows's voice, though. Too deep, sounded like two men. And then a door closing, and a vehicle, yes, definitely a vehicle driving off. But I didn't see anything. My curtains were drawn." "Did the voices seem angry?" Purbright asked. "Oh, no," she replied firmly. "Purposeful. The sort of voices men use when carrying heavy furniture. Or heavy secrets." Purbright nodded slowly. "Thank you, Mrs. Twigg. You've been very helpful." She beamed, pleased to be indispensable. Returning to the bedroom, Purbright found Love staring at the single shoe as though it might answer questions of its own accord. "Sir," Love said, "if Burrows is missing, if someone took him, wouldn't there be more signs? Broken things, a struggle?" "Not necessarily," Purbright said. If someone planned this, they would take care to leave little trace, especially if the man cooperated under duress, especially if they were professionals. Love's eyes widened. Professionals? As in, Purbright raised a hand, stopping him. We do not know, but Dr. Glendenning noted that the ear was severed cleanly, not the work of a panicked amateur. And Mr. Burroughs is involved in certain trades where valuable items pass through hands that are not always straightforward. You think this might be criminal? Love asked. Purbright arched a mild eyebrow. Love, when a man loses an ear and disappears overnight, the involvement of criminals becomes statistically significant. Love flushed slightly. Right. Yes, of course, sir. Purbright looked once more around the room. We must find out who would want something from Mr. Burroughs or who felt he had taken something from them. He picked up the notebook from the desk. The first few pages were filled with itemized lists of antiques purchased or sold. But near the back, a folded sheet of paper lay tucked between the pages. Purbright opened it. Inside was a hand-drawn sketch of what appeared to be a small wooden box, ornate, with carved floral patterns. Beneath the drawing was a note in Burroughs's neat handwriting. Meeting postponed. They insisted. Deliver quietly. Back hall. Midnight. Love leaned over his shoulder. Sir, that's the hall? Yes, Purbright said quietly. Our hall. He folded the paper thoughtfully. Burroughs had been planning a delivery in the middle of the night at the W.I. Hall, a delivery someone else had insisted be quiet. Midnight aligned closely with the time Mrs. Twigg heard voices. And a van engine. Someone had taken delivery and taken Burroughs. Purbright felt the threads begin to weave together, not clearly yet, but enough to suggest a pattern. He turned toward Love. We must find that box. Love blinked. You think the box is important? Purbright slipped the note into his pocket. Love, in Flaxboro, when someone insists on a secret delivery and a man loses an ear for his trouble, the object in question is never unimportant. He moved to the door. Let's return to the hall, he said. If the box changed hands there, we may find traces. As they left the flat behind, Purbright felt the first real stirrings of certainty. This was no random act. No drunken quarrel or accidental injury. Someone wanted something, and Gerald Burroughs had been caught between wanting and taking. And somewhere in Flaxboro, a small ornate box was missing, carrying with it the next step in the puzzle. Inspector Purbright left Gerald Burroughs' flat with the quiet certainty of a man who felt the investigation had finally acquired a spine thin, crooked and incomplete perhaps, but a spine nonetheless. Love followed, still glancing back at the door as though expecting Burroughs to burst out and complain about the disturbance. But Burroughs did not appear, and the silence that settled behind them felt less like absence and more like the residue of something forcibly removed. The walk back to the car was brisk, the air damp with the promise of more rain. Purbright took a long breath and turned onto the main road, the hall now fixed as the next necessary waypoint. The notebook sketch of the ornate box pressed lightly against his coat pocket, its presence a small but persistent pulse of intrigue. As they drove toward the Women's Institute, Purbright watched the passing shop fronts. Each business front carried its usual arrangement of local routine florists arguing with pot plants, a pair of elderly men performing the ritual exchange of disapproval outside the betting shop, and Mrs. Fenning struggling with a carrier bag too ambitious for her physical stature. Life in Flaxboro went on, unaware that somewhere among them lay a missing man, an ear, and a box that someone wanted badly enough to cut part of a man away. Love parked neatly by the side of the hall, a touch proud of his parallel alignment, though the car still sat slightly crooked by any objective measure. The back alley behind the hall was damp, soft mud bearing the blurred prints of the previous night's activity. Purbright stood over the last sharp print he had examined earlier, studying it once more with renewed attention. The pattern seemed purposeful, unfamiliar among the usual footwear of Flaxboro's inhabitants. Men who lived in market towns wore shoes shaped by long walks and mild neglect. This shoe looked foreign to those habits, firmer, more deliberate. "We're looking for that box," Purbright said softly, mostly to himself. Love nodded. "Sir, if Burroughs was delivering it secretly midnight, back hall, wouldn't someone have taken it already?" "Possibly. But people rarely remove all traces of their actions, especially hurried ones, and not all criminals are as tidy as they think." He pushed open the back door, which now stood firmly closed but offered no creak of resistance. The Women's Institute hall was empty, save for the faint, lingering scent of sponge cake and disapproval. Purbright crossed the room slowly, allowing his eyes to fall upon the corners that most people overlooked. It took him no more than a minute to notice the small irregularity, a faint scuff near the back of the stage riser that had not been present earlier. He crouched, peering into the gap beneath the riser. Something small glinted faintly, half shielded by shadow. Purbright reached in and retrieved a thin metal object, an earring, a small hoop of gold bent out of shape. Love squinted. A woman's earring? "Not necessarily," Purbright murmured. "Men have been known to wear such things too, but more importantly, it appears damaged. That suggests it may have been torn off during movement." Love's eyes widened. "Sir, do you think it belonged to Burroughs?" Purbright shook his head. "Unlikely. He had no piercings that I've ever observed. More likely it belonged to someone who was here last night or someone who came later." He straightened. "Search the hall. Methodically. Under tables, behind curtains, anywhere someone might drop something or dislodge it." For the next 20 minutes, the hall transformed into a quiet theater of investigation. Love crawled under tables with the earnest enthusiasm of an enthusiastic but easily winded terrier. Purbright moved with more measured calm, inspecting every corner with a precise, almost surgical focus. It was Purbright who found the next clue not dramatic, but undeniably relevant. Behind the stage curtains lay a flattened cardboard box. Not remarkable by appearance, but it bore faint traces of a rectangular shape outlined in dust. Something had once sat inside it, something small, likely wooden, given the faint grain impressions left behind. Purbright lifted it. "The box," he said. Love leaned in. "But it's empty." "Yes, but we now know something important. The box was here. It was placed here, likely last night or early this morning." Love scratched his head. "So someone met Burroughs here, took the box. But then why take his ear?" Purbright gave him a sidelong glance. "Punishment, perhaps, or persuasion. But we must avoid assuming we understand their motives prematurely. Our task remains to identify who wanted the box and why." Love nodded, but still looked troubled. "What do we do now, sir? We find out who else knew Burroughs was bringing something valuable to the hall." "Harold Pym?" Love offered. "He stayed behind. Possibly. Or someone involved with him. Or someone who discovered it accidentally." They left the hall through the front entrance. The street was busier now. Midday had arrived, bringing with it the industrious shuffle of errands and lunchtime gossip. As Purbright and Love crossed toward the car, Mrs. Fenning hurried over, waving as though signaling a departing ship. "Inspector! Inspector Purbright!" she called, breathlessly clutching her oversized handbag. Purbright paused with mild patience. "Yes, Mrs. Fenning. I thought I ought to tell you I remembered something important. Very important." Love braced himself for nonsense. Mrs. Fenning specialized in conveying the utterly trivial with catastrophic urgency. Purbright, however, simply inclined his head. "Please continue." "Well," she said, lowering her voice conspiratorially, "last night I saw Mr. Burroughs arguing with someone, just outside the Methodist chapel. I didn't see the other man clearly. He had a hat pulled low, but they were gesturing something fierce, and Mr. Burroughs kept pointing toward the W.I. Hall." Purbright considered this. What time was this? Around 10, maybe half past. Did you hear any part of what they were saying? No, but I heard the tone, she said proudly. And what did the tone suggest? That someone was going to be very, very sorry, she said with solemn conviction. Purbright thanked her, and she bustled away, confident she had contributed a vital piece to the investigation. Love frowned. Do you think it was the same person who came for the box? It is possible, Purbright said. Arguments often precede poor decisions. They returned to the car. Purbright leaned against it for a moment, thinking deeply. The investigation now had several strands. Burroughs's disappearance, the ear in the cream jug, the ornate box delivered at midnight, and an unknown man arguing with Burroughs shortly before he vanished. And somewhere among these threads lay a motive. Love, Purbright said at last. We must speak to Harold Pym again, but not at his home. Let's try the Amateur Dramatic Society's storage room. I have the feeling he may have revisited it today. Love nodded, eager. They drove to the Mercury Arms, where the society stored their props. Purbright approached the back door, hearing faint shuffling inside. He knocked gently. The shuffling paused, then resumed with the sort of forced nonchalance associated with frightened amateurs. The door opened, revealing Harold Pym, paler than before, and clutching a rolled theatrical backdrop like a makeshift shield. "Inspector," he said weakly, "I didn't expect you." "Mr. Pym," Purbright replied softly, "we need to talk." "I don't know anything more," Pym blurted, trembling slightly. "I told you I only stayed to find my scarf." Purbright stepped into the room, lowering his voice. "Mr. Pym, the box. You knew Burroughs was bringing it, didn't you?" Pym's silence lasted several heartbeats. Then he nodded. "Barely." Love exhaled sharply. Sir Purbright raised a hand for silence. "Mr. Pym," he continued gently, "you knew about the midnight delivery. You knew he was coming to the hall, and you knew he was meeting someone." Pym swallowed hard. "I didn't want to. I only overheard." He was muttering to himself during rehearsal. "He said something about bringing the piece to the hall, and he seemed scared, Inspector. Really scared. I didn't know what to do." "What did he say?" Purbright pressed. "He said he shouldn't have agreed. That they'd take it from him whether he delivered it or not. And he mentioned who they were." "No, but he said they weren't from Flaxboro." Purbright exchanged a look with Love. "Mr. Pym," he said softly, "you must tell us everything you know, because whatever Gerald Burroughs became involved in it is far from finished." Pym's face crumpled. "There's something else," he whispered. Purbright waited. "I saw the man he was meeting." Love stiffened. Purbright's voice remained calm. "Describe him." "No need," Pym said shakily. "He's here." Purbright turned slowly. A shadow moved behind the stacks of props. Someone had been listening the entire time. For a moment, so still it felt brittle, the cluttered prop room held its breath. Purbright turned, not quickly, but with the steady, courteous precision of a man opening a door he fully expected to find trouble behind. The shadow that had slipped behind the costume rack resolved itself into the unmistakable outline of a man, broad-shouldered, slightly hunched, favoring one leg, and holding himself with the tense stillness of someone not yet certain whether to flee or fight. "Come out, please," Purbright said gently. "There's no need for dramatics. The props already supply more than enough." The man paused, then stepped forward reluctantly. His face emerged under the dim bulb. Mid-40s, weathered complexion, dark stubble, eyes sharp with calculation rather than fear. He wore a worn leather jacket, muddy boots, and an expression that marked him as no resident of Flaxboro. Outsiders always carried a faint scent of urgency that locals lacked. Flaxboro life rarely required quick decisions. Love stiffened, instinctively inching closer to Purbright. Harold Pym shrank backward until his shoulders pressed into a stack of faux Grecian columns. Purbright regarded the stranger with polite curiosity. "You were listening." The man said nothing at first, but his jaw tensed. "I don't like being cornered." "You're not cornered," Purbright replied. "You're merely in a room. Corners are conceptual." The man blinked at that, thrown just enough off balance for Purbright to deepen the conversational wedge. "I believe," the inspector continued, "that you are acquainted with Gerald Burrows." The man's expression did not change, but there was the faintest tightening of his grip around the jacket seams. "You're the police," he said slowly. And that little man, he nodded toward Pym, never did know when to shut up. Purbright tilted his head. "Mr. Burrows appears to be missing. We are concerned for his safety. You may be able to help." The man laughed softly, humorless. "Quick. Safety. That man ran out of safety years ago." Love bristled. "Are you admitting something?" The man's eyes narrowed. "I'm admitting nothing to you." Purbright folded his hands lightly. "Perhaps you could start by telling us your name." A pause. Not quite defiance, more evaluation. "Call me Harker." Purbright offered a polite nod. "Very well, Mr. Harker. As you seem determined to remain enigmatic for the moment, let us proceed with a few basic questions. You met Gerald Burrows at the hall last night?" Harker gave a slow shrug. "We met." "Did he give you the box?" Harker's eyes flicked sharply. It was answer enough. Love took a step forward. "Where is Burrows now?" Harker's reply was instant and hard. "I don't know. And if I did, I wouldn't be telling you." Purbright's voice remained calm. "Mr. Harker, a man has lost an ear. Another man is missing. And you are here, lurking behind scenery like an understudy with misgivings. These are not flattering circumstances." A fractional twitch crossed Harker's face, anger, guilt, or frustration. "I didn't take his ear," he snapped. "I didn't even touch him. I waited for him at the hall. He arrived late, nervous as hell, muttering about being followed. He gave me the box and said he couldn't stay. He left. That's it." Purbright absorbed this. "And then, I left too." Harker folded his arms. "I had what I came for." "Where is the box now?" Harker's eyes hardened. "Not your concern." Love exhaled sharply, but Purbright lifted a hand to silence him. "Mr. Harker," Purbright said gently. "Burrows wrote in his notebook that the delivery had been postponed, that they insisted." "Was that they, you?" Harker's jaw tightened. "I insisted because he'd been holding it back for weeks. Said he was waiting for the right moment. More like waiting for a higher bidder." "So the box is valuable," Purbright said. Harker hesitated. "Depends who you ask." "Then allow me to ask. What was inside it?" Harker looked away. "I don't know. I'm just the courier." Pym made a small, frightened noise. "He's lying. Burrows said he was being forced, coerced, threatened." Harker shot him a glare that froze Pym solid. Purbright stepped between them with quiet authority. "Mr. Harker, did you see anyone else near the hall? Anyone who might have followed Burrows?" Harker seemed poised to deny everything, but the question struck something, perhaps practicality. "There was a van," he said at last. "Parked down the lane, engine running, lights off, didn't look local." Purbright nodded slowly. "Did you see who was inside?" "No, but Burrows saw it. That's why he rushed off." "And you didn't follow him?" "Not my problem. My job was done." Purbright studied him for a long moment. The man was hard, but not the sort who severed ears. He carried the blunt-edged pragmatism of smugglers and couriers, the kind who moved things without asking questions, provided they were paid promptly. But the violence inflicted on Burrows had come from someone else. Purbright stepped back a pace. "Mr. Harker, you will accompany us to the station, for your own safety as much as ours." Harker scoffed. "Do you think I'm afraid?" "No," Purbright said mildly. But it would be inconvenient if someone else thought you were responsible. People with van engines running in dark lanes often think in simple terms of blame. Love moved behind Harker as if to usher him forward, but Purbright raised a subtle hand. "Harker," he added softly, "you may be many things, but you do not strike me as a murderer. If we are to find Burroughs alive or otherwise, we will need the truth, and I believe you might give us at least part of it." Harker's shoulders lowered by a fraction, the first sign of concession. "All right," he muttered. "I'll come. But I'm not staying long." Purbright nodded politely. "We shall consider that negotiation at a later stage." They moved out of the prop room, Harker walking between Purbright and Love. Pym slumped into a chair the moment they left, as though sheer terror had been using his spine for balance. Outside, the afternoon had grown grayer, the wind heavy with the threat of rain. Purbright walked with deliberate calm, but his thoughts churned quietly. Harker was not the central villain of the piece. He was a hinge useful, but not the whole mechanism. Someone else had taken Burroughs. Someone else had removed the ear, and someone else wanted the box. As they reached the car, Love cleared his throat. "Sir, what if Burroughs isn't alive?" Purbright paused, his hand on the car door. "We must allow for the possibility," he said softly, "but we must not accept it without cause. And if whoever has him also has the box?" "Then they are very desperate," Purbright answered, "and desperate people make mistakes." Harker climbed into the back seat with the wary dignity of a man entering a place where he did not trust the furniture. Purbright settled beside Love, but before Love could start the engine, a figure hurried down the pavement toward them. Mrs. Ivy Peet, practically vibrating with indignation. "Inspector, I've been looking everywhere for you," she declared. Purbright opened the door politely. "Mrs. Peet, always a pleasure. How may we assist?" "Something dreadful has happened," she huffed. "The caretaker, Mrs. Tegg, hasn't turned up for her afternoon duties, and she always arrives exactly at 2. She's a stickler for time. I believe this here business has frightened her into hiding." Purbright exchanged a glance with Love. "Mrs. Tegg?" he asked. "When did you last see her?" "Last night," Mrs. Peet said. "At the hall. She came to check the locks." Purbright felt the investigation shift as though the floor beneath it had leaned. "Did she speak to anyone?" "She spoke to Mr. Burroughs." Love inhaled sharply. Harker leaned forward in the back seat. Purbright's voice remained calm. "Mrs. Peet, are you certain?" "Absolutely," she said smugly. "I heard them myself. Something about a box." Purbright closed the car door gently. The case had just acquired a new axis. Mrs. Tegg quiet, consistent, reliable. Mrs. Tegg had been the last person to speak with Burroughs before he vanished, and now Mrs. Tegg herself was missing. Purbright straightened, the quiet weight of inexorable deduction settling into place. "Love," he said, "we must find her." And as the first drops of rain began to fall, Inspector Purbright knew the small town of Flaxboro was about to reveal a far darker seam beneath its ordinary, respectable surface. Inspector Purbright watched Mrs. Peet bustle away with her usual self-satisfaction, the kind that suggested she believed herself to be the moral hinge upon which the entire town's respectability swung. As she disappeared around the corner, Purbright turned his attention back to the matter that now pressed more urgently against the investigation. Mrs. Tegg's unexplained absence and her late-night conversation with Gerald Burroughs about a box she had no apparent business knowing anything about. He settled into the passenger seat, motioning Love to start the engine. Harker remained in the back, arms crossed tightly, his expression sliding between irritation and apprehension as the car pulled away from the curb. "Sir," Love said, "if Mrs. Tegg was the last person to speak with Burroughs, and now she's missing, do you think she's been taken too?" Purbright kept his gaze on the road ahead. "Possibly. Or she may have gone into hiding. Fear can drive people in unpredictable directions." Harker let out a quiet, humorless snort. Caretakers don't get mixed up in things like this without reason. Love glanced back sharply. And you'd know that how? Because criminals don't work with amateurs, Harker said, his tone flat. If she got involved, it wasn't by accident. Purbright considered this without comment. There was something about Harker's perspective, his quiet assurance in matters of illegality, that suggested he understood far more about the ecosystem surrounding the missing box than he wished to say. "We shall begin at Mrs. Tegg's cottage," Purbright said. "If she has fled, there may be signs. If she has been taken, there may be clues. And if she is simply late," he offered a mild smile, "we may be scolded for troubling her." Love nodded, though he doubted the latter possibility. Mrs. Tegg was known throughout Flaxboro as punctuality personified, a woman who considered lateness a moral failing. For her to vanish was as improbable as a church clock intentionally striking the wrong hour. The cottage sat at the end of a narrow lane lined with shrubs Mrs. Tegg trimmed to within an inch of botanical health. The front garden was immaculate grass, evenly clipped, flower beds weeded, every edge firm and symmetrical. Yet there was something distinctly wrong. The gate stood slightly ajar. Mrs. Tegg never left any door, real or metaphorical, open. Purbright stepped out, motioning Love to wait until he examined the gate's latch. He held it lightly between two fingers. "Not broken," he murmured. "Simply unlatched. Either she left in a hurry, or someone left after her." Love's expression stiffened. "Shall I go round the back?" "Gently," Purbright replied. "We have no reason to assume danger, but caution never costs much." As Love headed down the side path, Purbright approached the front door. He tapped once. No answer. He pressed his ear closer. Silence, thick enough to feel. He tried the handle. Locked. Harker leaned out of the car window. "Shouldn't you break it down?" Purbright turned toward him. "Doors are rarely obstacles unless we make them so." He withdrew a thin brass tool from his coat, more delicate than the one used earlier at Burroughs's flat, and inserted it into the keyhole with deft familiarity. The lock yielded with a soft click, opening inward as if too polite to resist. The interior of the cottage smelled faintly of lavender polish and boiled cabbage, entirely consistent with Mrs. Tegg. But the atmosphere felt wrong. Too still, too vacant. Purbright stepped inside, scanning the hallway. A coat hung neatly on its peg. An umbrella rested in its stand. A pair of house shoes were placed beside a mat woven with the words, "Welcome with reason." Love appeared at the rear doorway. "Sir, the back door is locked from the inside." No sign of forced entry. "Thank you, Love." Purbright moved into the sitting room. The lace curtains were drawn, but not evenly. One panel hung slightly off-center. Mrs. Tegg would never tolerate such a symmetry. On the small table by the window lay her spectacles, folded and placed atop the morning newspaper. It was open to an article on pension reforms. He skimmed quickly. No stains, tears, or signs of panic. She had been reading calmly. A mug sat on the armchair's side table. Its content had cooled completely. Purbright touched the rim. Cool, but not cold, likely left untouched for several hours. Love noticed this too. "Do you think she was taken while reading?" Purbright shook his head. "Taken, Love, implies struggle. This cottage bears no signs of such. No overturned objects, no broken items, no distress. She left this room willingly." Harker stepped through the doorway, ignoring Love's glare. Maybe she went to meet someone. If she knew about the box, if she overheard something, someone might have convinced her to hand Burroughs over, or deliver a message. Purbright regarded him with mild interest. "That is one possibility." He moved into the kitchen. The sink was empty. The draining board held a single plate and fork. Mrs. Tegg had eaten breakfast. A small calendar hung beside the pantry door. Today's date bore a neat red circle, undoubtedly her own marking. Next to it, collect hall keys from Mrs. Pete, Thames, Thame. But the keys were still on their hook near the door. So she did not leave willingly, Love murmured. She didn't even take her bag or keys. Not necessarily willingly, Purbright agreed, but voluntarily may be more accurate. He glanced down. Near the doormat was a faint, almost invisible indentation, a small footprint made by a narrow shoe, the kind worn indoors or by someone who didn't wish to be heard. He knelt, tracing the outline. "This," he said, "is not Mrs. Tegg's footprint." Love crouched. "It's too small for a man, and too narrow for her," Purbright replied. "We have someone else here." Harker crossed his arms. "Maybe she let someone in." Love frowned. "But why would she? She barely speaks to people unless they're on her approved conversational list." Purbright continued moving through the cottage, entering the modest bedroom at the back. The bed was made. The wardrobe stood closed. But on the small writing desk near the window, a single sheet of paper lay beneath a pencil, weighted by an iron paperweight shaped like a cat. Purbright lifted the paperweight gently and read the note. "Inspector Purbright, I must speak with you. It concerns Gerald Burrows and the box. Do not trust the man in the leather jacket. I'm going where he cannot follow." Monsieur Tegg Love inhaled sharply. "Sir," she knew Harker. Harker swore under his breath. "I've never seen that old woman in my life." Purbright read the note once more, absorbing its tone. It did not sound like the writing of a woman in panic. It felt deliberate. But something else struck him. He compared the pencil strokes with the indentation beneath. The pressure was unusually light, too careful, almost forced. "She wrote this under duress," he murmured. Love blinked. "But it sounds calm." "Calmness can be manufactured," Purbright replied. "Read the last line." Love leaned closer. "I'm going where he cannot follow." "That," Purbright said softly, "is not the voice of a woman aware of real danger. It is the voice of someone repeating what they have been told to write." Harker scowled. "You're accusing me." "No," Purbright said smoothly, "but someone intended me to suspect you." He turned the note over. A faint imprint letters pressed through from a previous sheet. He held it toward the light. The indentation formed a single phrase, likely written earlier on the same pad. He said they would come for me. Purbright felt the room's temperature shift. This was no simple disappearance. Mrs. Tegg had not fled. She had been escorted or coerced by someone who wanted Purbright misdirected, and that someone had likely arrived shortly after Burrows vanished. He turned to Love. "We must find Mrs. Tegg immediately." Love stiffened. "Where do we begin, sir?" Purbright walked toward the front hallway, his steps measured but urgent. "Mrs. Tegg is not the sort to go far. If she left against her will, she was moved swiftly. We must check the surrounding lanes for signs of a vehicle. Footprints, anything disturbed." He paused at the door and looked back at Harker. "You said there was a van last night. Describe it." Harker shrugged. "Grey. Small. Boxy type. Not new. Driver kept the lights off." Purbright nodded. "A van like that cannot hide for long in Flaxboro." We stepped outside into the gathering rain. The air felt tighter, as though the town itself held its breath. Someone had taken Burrows. Someone had taken Mrs. Tegg. And someone had the box. The three events were no longer separate threads. They were now a single rope, pulling tighter. Purbright lifted his coat collar against the rain. "Love," he said, "we start with the lanes heading out of town. Whoever took her would not risk lingering. And something tells me Mrs. Tegg would leave a sign, however small." Love nodded firmly. Harker watched them, thoughtful, wary. Purbright glanced back once more. "And Mr. Harker," he added, "I suggest you remain where you can be found. This matter grows more complicated by the minute, and I would hate to lose track of an individual who may soon be in considerable danger." Harker paled just enough to confirm the inspector's suspicion. Harker had no idea who else was involved, and that meant the investigation had widened beyond the expectations of everyone involved, especially Purbright's. Inspector Purbright stepped out into the rain with an unhurried calm that belied the tension tightening around the investigation. The sky had darkened into a dull pewter, the sort that pressed low upon Flaxboro and made even the chimneys seem thoughtful. Love followed a step behind, glancing over, his shoulder at Mrs. Tegg's cottage as though expecting her to appear in the doorway with a broom and a reprimand. The lane outside her garden was slick with fresh rainfall, the puddles unbroken except where a pair of faint tire impressions had begun to soften at their edges. Purbright knelt beside them, touching the mud lightly. "A van," he murmured. "Recent. Heavy enough to compress the ground before the rain softened it." Love bent beside him. "Same kind as the one Harker mentioned?" "Quite possibly." Harker, from the car, leaned out just far enough to call, "Looks like every van ever driven in England. You'll get nowhere with that." Purbright straightened without looking back. "Every van leaves its own conversation in the ground. We simply have to listen carefully." Love blinked, unsure how literally to take that. Purbright stepped further down the lane, his gaze moving with slow, deliberate sweeps. "Love, follow the tire impressions. They may join the high street or diverge toward the industrial estate. Mrs. Tegg's abduction, if we may call it that, would not have required a long journey. Their goal was speed and obscurity, not distance." Love hurried ahead to trace the marks, but Purbright remained a moment longer, studying the cottage. Furniture undisturbed, no broken locks, no panic in the items she left behind. This was not a violent seizure. It was something quieter, more deliberate. Mrs. Tegg had either been persuaded or deceived into leaving, and yet the false note suggested she was not a willing participant. Harker approached from behind, hands loosely in pockets. If they took her, why leave such a tidy scene? "Seems sloppy." Purbright gave him a measured look. "Sloppy criminals panic. These were not panicked." "You think they were professionals?" "I think," Purbright said. "They were efficient." Love called out from the end of the lane. "Sir!" The tracks split. Some turned left toward the old mill road. Purbright walked down to inspect them himself. Indeed, the softer ground showed the path diverging one direction, leading into the bustle of Flaxboro's center, the other veering toward the outskirts where abandoned warehouses and unused river docks still stood as relics of a more industrious past. "Left," Purbright said without hesitation. Love frowned. "But wouldn't criminals want crowds to hide in, not criminals in possession of a person and, very likely, something they desperately wanted to keep concealed? Crowds offer camouflage. Seclusion offers certainty." He returned to the car. Harker eyed him warily. "You're taking me with you?" Harker asked. "You came voluntarily," Purbright replied, "and I suspect you may recognize something the moment we arrive." Harker muttered something impolite but climbed in nonetheless. Love drove. The rain thickened, tapping against the windscreen with a rhythm that made the outskirts of town seem even more deserted. The winding road curved away from the safety of street lamps and into patches of uneven ground. Old warehouses loomed up like silent, slouching giants, roofs caved in at points, windows either broken or shielded by warped boards. "Sir," Love said softly, "this area isn't used anymore." "Except by yes," Purbright said mildly. "By people who prefer not to be observed." He motioned for Love to pull over near an old tannery building, its faded signage clinging stubbornly to a wall that no longer deserved its loyalty. The tire tracks grew clearer here, carved into softer earth beneath the tall grass. Purbright stepped out, lifting his umbrella. The rain formed a mist around the derelict structure, giving it the unsettling impression of watching them. "Sir," Love murmured. "This feels?" "Well, it feels like the sort of place things happen." "Things do indeed happen here," Purbright agreed, "but only because people bring them here." They advanced cautiously. Harker stayed close but did not bolt. His expression, however, had sharpened. "You recognize this place," Purbright said quietly. Harker's jaw tightened. "Had a drop here 2 years ago. Goods passing through. Nothing to do with this." Purbright stopped walking. "Is there something inside?" Harker hesitated. "Not usually." "Usually," Purbright said, "is a dangerous word." Love found the side door partly open. He froze, gesturing sharply. Purbright approached. The door hung crooked on one hinge, swaying slightly in the wind, tapping the frame with a soft, steady knock. Purbright motioned for Love to stand aside. He peered in. The interior was dim, lit only by the grey daylight filtering through holes in the roof. Damp boards lay broken underfoot. The air smelled of mildew, rust, and something else, gasoline, faint but present. He stepped inside. Harker followed reluctantly. Love came last. At first glance, the large room appeared empty, but Purbright's eyes, trained by years of Flaxboro's understated brand of mischief, noted the details others missed. Mud smudges leading deeper inside, a dragged mark across the floor, a discarded cloth near the far wall. "Sir," Love said tightly, "does that look like?" "Blood?" "A small amount," Purbright confirmed. "Old but not ancient. Someone bled here, not heavily. More like a nosebleed or cut lip than a wound of significance." "And Mrs. Tegg," Love whispered. "At her age," Purbright said softly, "the smallest force can produce sharp consequence." They moved toward the back. The building narrowed into a corridor-like wing. The mud prints grew clearer, here one set small, unmistakably Mrs. Tegg's tidy shoe size, the other larger. The prints stopped at a wooden door, half blocked by a fallen beam. Love gripped the beam. "Sir, help me." Harker surprised them both by joining in silently, bracing his shoulder against the beam with terse focus. Together they shifted it enough to open the door. Purbright nudged it wide. Inside lay a small storage room, half-collapsed roof letting in a cone of drizzling light. A chair sat in the middle. Rope hung from one of her, the legs frayed where it had been cut. But Mrs. Tegg was gone. Instead, lying neatly atop the chair was her knitted cardigan, folded as though she had done it herself. Upon it rested something small and wooden, the ornate box. Love took a sharp breath. "Sir, the box. They left it?" Purbright moved closer, circling it with measured caution. The carvings matched the sketch in Burroughs's notebook, intricate floral patterns, delicate curls shaped by a skilled hand. He did not touch it yet. "Why leave the box?" Harker murmured, unsettled. "Makes no sense." Purbright's eyes narrowed. "Unless the box is no longer what they wanted." He bent closer. The lid was slightly ajar. Inside lay nothing. Empty. "They removed whatever it contained," Purbright said, "and left the container." "You think they dumped it because it's worthless without the contents?" Love asked. "Perhaps." Or Purbright glanced around the room. Perhaps this was a message. Harker stepped forward, frowning. "A message to who?" "To everyone involved," Purbright replied. "Burroughs, Mrs. Tegg, you, and now, to me." Love stared anxiously around the silent room. "Sir, if they left the box and took her—" "Then they did not flee far," Purbright said. "Not with the rain softening the ground. Whoever came here moved quickly, and left quickly." Love's voice dropped. "You think she's still alive?" Purbright did not look at him. "I think they needed her long enough to extract what she knew, and once they had that, they left her fate undecided." He turned back to the box. Harker, what do you know about the contents? Nothing, Harker insisted. I told you I wasn't paid to know. Purbright stared at him for several long seconds. And that is precisely what worries me. He picked up the cardigan. Under it, tucked beneath the chair, lay something else, a small, torn scrap of paper with writing in hurried pencil. He unfolded it carefully. Inspector, they know he hid it. Not the box, the other one. Find the first piece. Empty. Love blinked. Sir. Another piece. Another box? No, Purbright said quietly. Something else. Something Burroughs hid. Something they wanted more than the box. He slipped the paper into his pocket. Then he lifted the ornate box itself, light, hollow, meaningless, without its secret. Love, he said. We must return to Burroughs's flat. He hid something there, and Mrs. Tegg tried to warn us before they forced her away. Love swallowed. And if they go back there too? Purbright closed the box gently. Then we must arrive first. He stepped out of the room into the grey afternoon, the rain falling harder now. Flaxboro's secrets were beginning to surface, but so were its predators. Inspector Purbright left the derelict tannery with the ornate box held firmly beneath his arm, its deceptive lightness a quiet reminder that the true weight of the mystery lay elsewhere. The rain had strengthened into a steady curtain that blurred the outlines of the warehouses and muffled even the sound of their footsteps. Love hurried beside him, the tension in his shoulders rising with every passing second. Harker trailed them, slower and more guarded now, as though the abandoned building had drawn some certainty out of him and replaced it with doubt. They reached the car. Purbright set the box on the back seat beside Harker, who eyed it uneasily, as if the empty interior contained more danger now that its purpose was unknown. Love slid behind the wheel, glancing repeatedly at the inspector, waiting for an indication of their next move. Purbright settled into the passenger seat. Back to Burroughs's flat, he said quietly. If he hid something, he hid it somewhere familiar, and he would not have chosen the hall, not once he suspected he was being followed. Love started the engine. The car jolted forward, tires hissing through the wet road as they pulled away from the industrial outskirts and turned back toward the heart of Flaxboro. The familiar houses and shops re-emerged from the rain as they approached town, each one carrying its own quiet routines that appeared oblivious to the widening secret threading its way through their streets. Only Purbright's gaze remained fixed on something unseen. Love finally voiced what had been troubling him. Sir, Mrs. Tegg's note. Do you think the first piece means another box, or something connected to it? Burroughs dealt in items he rarely fully understood, Purbright replied. But he understood value and danger. Whatever the first piece is, it is important enough that someone used force to find it. More force than one normally applies in a disagreement over antiques. Harker scoffed softly. You still think this is about antiques? Purbright regarded him. Do enlighten us, Mr. Harker, since you seem eager to dismiss that possibility. Harker hesitated, then rubbed his jaw in frustration. All I know is this. I was hired to collect the box. That's it. I wasn't told what was inside. I wasn't told who would come for the rest. But men don't get their ears cut off for old wooden carvings, and they don't take caretakers hostage for furniture pieces. Purbright nodded slightly. Exactly. Which means Burroughs stumbled into something older and more valuable than the box appeared. Love frowned, but he didn't have the first piece. That's what Mrs. Tegg said. Correct, Purbright murmured. He hid it, and they know he hid it, which means they will search everywhere he frequented, everywhere he kept private, everywhere he might have thought safe. And his flat is the first place they'd try, Love said. Quite, Purbright said. They drove the remaining distance in silence. The rain thinned to a steady drizzle by the time they reached Burroughs's shop. The street was quiet, more so than earlier, as though the neighbors had collectively sensed unease and retreated indoors. Purbright stepped out first. The flat above the shop looked unchanged, the curtains still drawn, the windows reflecting only the pale shine of street lamps. "Love," Purbright said. "Remain alert. Harker, stay behind us. If you run, I shall assume you have decided to join the other side." Harker muttered under his breath, but complied. The staircase groaned under their ascent. Purbright paused at the landing, listening. No voices, no movement. Only the faint hum of the building settling in the cool, damp air. He unlocked the door and pushed it open. The flat felt heavier now, less a space occupied and more a space abandoned. The faint smell of tobacco lingered, mixed with the sharper scent of wet fabric from the living room where Pym had sat earlier, trembling. Purbright walked directly to the writing desk, the last place where something meaningful had been left behind. The desk drawer where the notebook had come from lay half open. He slid it out fully this time, examining its depth. Nothing inside but loose papers and old receipts. Love checked the wardrobe again. "Sir, nothing's changed. Everything's still here." Purbright knelt before the small bookshelf beside the desk. Burroughs had kept a sparse collection, auction catalogues, reference guides, and several obscure volumes about local history. Purbright skimmed the titles. One book caught his eye, not because it was unusual, but because its placement was wrong. The books around it bore thin layers of dust. This one did not. He pulled it free. The book was hollow. Inside lay a small pouch leather, soft, carefully stitched. Love stepped closer, breath catching. "Sir, is that it?" Purbright opened the pouch delicately. A small object fell into his palm. It was a fragment of carved bone, smooth, aged, etched with delicate markings so fine they seemed to shift in the low light. It was unmistakably old, possibly ancient, and certainly valuable to anyone who knew what they were looking at. Harker stared. "I've never seen that before." "And yet someone expected Burroughs to have it," Purbright said. Love swallowed. "Sir, what is it?" Purbright examined the markings. A relic, a fragment of something larger, something that was once kept together with the object in the ornate box. "So the box wasn't the treasure," Love murmured. "This was." Purbright nodded. "Which means our abductors still believe Burroughs may have hidden the rest. They have gone after Mrs. Tegg because they think she knows what he told her." Harker leaned forward. "If you've got the first piece, they'll want it." "Now." Purbright slipped the bone fragment back into the pouch, then into his coat. "That," he said, "is why we must find them before they realize Burroughs's flat is a dead end." As he stood, a sound drifted up the staircase, a car door slamming, then another. Love stiffened. "Sir, someone's outside." Purbright extinguished the desk lamp and motioned for silence. They crept toward the window. Peering through a narrow gap in the curtains, Purbright saw a gray van pulling up behind their own car. Its headlights off, engine still running. Two men stepped out. Not local, too purposeful in stride, too coordinated in posture. "They've come back," Harker whispered. Purbright nodded. "They think Mrs. Tegg told us something, or they simply wish to search again." "Sir," Love whispered urgently, "if they come up the stairs, they will," Purbright said calmly. "But they do not yet know we are inside." He scanned the room, assessing exits. The bathroom window, too small, the rear alley from the kitchen. Feasible, but noisy. Not ideal. A floorboard creaked in the stairwell. Love inhaled sharply. Purbright gave him a look, one of quiet reassurance, not bravado. "Gentlemen," he whispered, "this is now a matter of timing." Another step. Another creak. The men were climbing carefully, uncertain whether they were alone or expected. Purbright's hand moved toward the pouch in his coat. "Love," he murmured when they enter, "stay behind me." Mr. Harker, if you flee, I will arrest you myself." Harker froze. The footsteps reached the landing. A shadow passed beneath the door. Love's whisper trembled. "Sir, what do we do?" Purbright's reply was soft, measured, and unmistakably confident. "We give them the impression that they are not the hunters." The doorknob began to turn. The doorknob turned with a slow, testing motion, the kind used by men who expected resistance but preferred not to meet it head-on. Purbright remained perfectly still, every line of his posture relaxed, giving the impression of a man standing in his own sitting room waiting for a late visitor. Love, by contrast, stood rigid as a lamp-post in a thunderstorm, his breath shallow and audible. Harker pressed himself against the far wall, eyes narrowed with the wary calculation of someone deciding whether to bolt, bluff, or barricade. The door pushed inward with a soft groan. Two men stepped into the darkened flat, burly, ill-shaven, dressed in muted tones that tried and failed to appear inconspicuous. Their eyes swept through the dim interior, adjusting to the half-light. They did not expect calm voices. "Good evening, gentlemen," Purbright said, as though greeting a pair of parishioners who had arrived too early for choir practice. "You seem to be in a dreadful hurry." The first man froze. The second's hand darted instinctively toward his jacket, stopped dead by Purbright's raised hand. "I wouldn't advise that," Purbright said mildly. "Sergeant Love here is armed, though I assure you his nerves make him only moderately accurate." Love's hand had indeed moved toward his holster, though more out of terror than tactical intent. The taller intruder's throat bobbed in a swallow. "Who are you?" he demanded. Purbright sounded genuinely apologetic. "Inspector Purbright, local constabulary. This is a private residence, though I suspect you are already aware of that." The second man, shorter, wider, meaner, took a step forward. "We're here for something." "Yes," Purbright said softly. "You were here earlier as well." "Looking for something Mr. Burroughs hid," he tapped his coat lightly, a gesture subtle enough not to declare possession of anything but meaningful enough to catch the men's attention. "I regret to inform you that your search was clumsy." The shorter man bristled. "Where is he?" Purbright kept his tone level. "That is precisely what I'm trying to determine." There was a taut silence. The taller man's eyes flicked toward Harker. "You again." Harker straightened. "I'm not with them." "Not with us," the man scoffed. "You were the one supposed to bring it in. The old man said you were his handler." Purbright raised a hand slightly. "Let's clarify, shall we? Who hired you, and why did you believe Mr. Burroughs had more than the box?" The intruders exchanged a look that betrayed more than their words. "We're asking the questions," the shorter one snapped. Purbright exhaled through his nose, a sound of mild disappointment. "That phrase," he said, "tends to precede foolish decisions." What followed was not dramatic. Purbright was not a man who believed in theatrics. He simply shifted his weight, angled his body, and in the space of a breath reached out and pressed the nearest wall switch. The room flooded with light. The intruders flinched. Love seized the moment, drawing his revolver with an enthusiasm entirely disproportionate to his coordination. Harker remained motionless, braced for trouble. Purbright held up both hands, calm, authoritative. "Gentlemen," he said, "I must insist you sit." The shorter intruder moved first not to obey, but to flee. His instinct was quick, but Purbright's voice was quicker. "Move toward that door," he said evenly, "and every constable in this district will be on top of you before you've cleared the first landing." Sergeant Love here is already trembling with anticipation. Love was indeed trembling. It was unclear whether anticipation was involved. The taller man, seeing nothing but disadvantage in resistance, sat heavily on the edge of Burroughs's sofa. The shorter man hesitated, then grudgingly followed. Purbright nodded approvingly. "Now we may speak sensibly." He pulled a chair opposite them, sitting with the unhurried grace of a man settling in for a long conversation. "Tell me why you believe Gerald Burrows hid something other than the box." The taller man shifted. "Because he did. He tried to sell it. Not to us." Purbright's brows rose only slightly. An attempted double deal. That's what the boss figured. Said Burrows was stalling. Said if he didn't hand over both pieces last night, someone else would get to him first. "Both pieces," Purbright repeated. "You were expecting two." The shorter man glared, as though realizing he'd already said too much. "We were told," he said reluctantly, "that the box was one part of a set. The other piece, something small, old, was what the boss really wanted." Love looked at Purbright, startled. "Sir, the bone fragment?" Purbright nodded slightly. "Indeed." The taller intruder continued, disgruntled. "We came to collect both. All we found was an empty box and no Burrows." "And Mrs. Tegg?" Purbright asked quietly. Both men stiffened. Their shared glance was sharp, uneasy. "We didn't take her," the shorter man said. "We only followed Burrows to the hall, but someone else was there ahead of us. Someone driving a different van." Purbright felt the shift, a quiet, decisive click in the machinery of the case. "Another party, another van, another motive." "Describe it," he said. "Black. Newer. Didn't belong around here." "Did you see the driver?" The taller man nodded. "Yeah. Middle-aged. Clean-shaven. Looked like he knew exactly what he wanted. He grabbed Burrows before we could even get close, pulled him into the van and drove off." Love's breath hitched. "Alive. For a bit," the man muttered. "We heard shouting, then it went quiet." Purbright felt a somber weight settle in the room, but he kept his tone steady. "And Mrs. Tegg?" The shorter man shook his head. "Didn't see her. Might have been inside the van, might have been taken later." Purbright nodded slowly. The pieces aligned. There were two groups, Harker's employers, who wanted the pieces for profit, and another group, far more decisive, far more ruthless, who wanted them for reasons not yet explained. Purbright rose from his chair. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You have been unexpectedly helpful." The intruders exchanged confused glances. Purbright motioned to Love. "Escort these gentlemen to the station. Charge them with breaking and entering. We will speak again shortly." Love swallowed. "Yes, sir." The men stood warily, hands raised as Love directed them toward the door. Purbright turned to Harker. "You, Mr. Harker, are not under arrest. Yet, but I strongly advise you remain nearby until I request otherwise." Harker's voice wavered. "Who are these people, Inspector? The ones in the black van?" Purbright looked out into the rain-blurred street. "That," he said softly, "is what we must discover. Quickly." He reached into his coat and withdrew the pouch containing the carved fragment. "Burrows hid something worth more than money," he murmured. "Something someone was willing to sever an ear for and abduct two people over." Harker swallowed hard. "What now?" he whispered. Purbright buttoned his coat, stepping into the corridor with calm resolve. "Now," he said, "we find Mrs. Tegg and the man in the black van." He paused. "And then," he added gently, "we end this." Inspector Purbright left the flat with the calm certainty of a man who had just listened to the final missing notes of a long, discordant melody. The rain had tapered to a thin drizzle that clung to rooftops and softened the edges of the street lamps. Love walked beside him, tense, alert, glancing at every passing shadow as though expecting the man in the black van to materialize from them. Harker followed reluctantly, as if tethered by an invisible string to the inspector's quiet authority. Purbright led them not toward the station, but toward his own car, parked a few steps down the street. "They know we have the first piece," he said mildly, as Love unlocked the doors. "Which means they will either flee or they will come to claim it. and men who sever ears do not tend to flee. Love shivered. So they'll come for us, sir? Purbright opened the passenger door. If we're fortunate. Harker looked baffled. Fortunate? Purbright nodded. It is considerably easier to apprehend someone who comes directly to you than someone who requires pursuit. Love blinked, silently absorbing the philosophy, and started the engine. Purbright directed him away from the town center, not toward the industrial outskirts, but toward a narrower road leading out past the river and toward the old phone exchange, a squat, forgotten building that once served as the telephone switching hub before being retired into architectural obscurity. Harker frowned as he recognized the path. Why are we going there? Because, Purbright said, it is one of the few places in Flaxboro that is both out of the way and still used unofficially. Smugglers used it in the 70s. Local mischief makers still use it now, and the black van, I suspect, has been there already. Love cast a nervous glance at the inspector. Sir, how? But Purbright held up a hand. Hush a moment. His gaze drifted across the slick road. Droplets streaked along the window as the headlights illuminated the low utilitarian structure at the edge of a fenced-in gravel lot. The chain-link gate hung open. Tire marks, the deep, fresh kind, crossed the wet ground in overlapping arcs. Love swallowed. Sir, someone's here. Purbright nodded. Indeed. He motioned for the lights to be extinguished and the engine to idle quietly. The silence that followed was dense and taut, broken only by the steady patter of rain against metal. They stepped out cautiously. Purbright signaled for Love to remain slightly behind him, for Harker to stay close but not close enough to be impulsive. The entrance door to the exchange stood ajar. Purbright approached it without haste, as though expecting nothing more alarming than a misplaced utility bill. He eased it open with 2 fingers. Inside, the dim space hummed faintly with residual electrical life. Old switching boards lined the walls like slumbering machines, and in the center of the room, seated on a wooden chair with her hands tied in front of her, cheeks flushed but eyes fierce, was Mrs. Tegg. She looked up as Purbright entered. Inspector, you took your time. Love exhaled in pure relief. Harker muttered something like a prayer. Purbright allowed himself one small nod of satisfaction. Mrs. Tegg, he said gently, I am relieved to see you appear quite intact. I should hope so, she sniffed. The men who took me were very unpleasant, but not entirely foolish. They realized after 10 minutes that abducting an elderly woman with lumbago was not conducive to their timetable. Purbright approached her slowly. Then they left you here? They left me, she said, bristling with restrained indignation after interrogating me about Mr. Burroughs' secrets. Naturally, I told them nothing. Purbright began untying the rope. Naturally. Love glanced nervously toward the dark corners of the room. Sir? Where are they now? Mrs. Tegg straightened her back with a supreme effort and pointed toward the rear exit of the exchange. They rushed off not 3 minutes ago. Something about realizing they'd been misled and needing to retrieve the old man's first hiding place. They were quite confused. I suspect you had something to do with that. Purbright merely hummed at the suggestion. He helped her stand. Mrs. Tegg, did they mention where the first hiding place might be? She pursed her lips. Only that it was somewhere obvious. Somewhere Burroughs knew well and somewhere a fool might overlook. Purbright smiled faintly. Then I believe I know precisely where they are going. Love's eyes widened. Sir, the shop? Correct, Purbright said. Not the flat, his shop. Burroughs hid the second piece of the puzzle in his residence, but he would have hidden the first piece somewhere tied to his trade, somewhere commonplace to him, somewhere that might easily escape the notice of men who expected treasure to be dramatic. He turned toward the door. The shop, Love. Quickly. They hurried back to the car, Mrs. Tegg insisting she could climb in unassisted, which she managed after only minimal struggle. Love drove with renewed purpose, the rain now sheeting across the windshield in long, diagonal strokes. When they reached Burroughs and Curios, the street was deserted, but the lights inside the shop, previously dark, now flickered faintly. 2 figures moved within. Purbright stepped out of the car, straightening his coat. Love, remain beside me. Harker behind us. Harker obliged, though his hands trembled. As Purbright approached the shop door, the sound of rummaging grew louder, boxes being thrown aside, objects clattering, the frustrated grunts of men searching with urgency but little finesse. Purbright opened the door quietly. The 2 intruders, different from those earlier, but unmistakably aligned with the same group, did not hear him at first. One overturned a jewelry cabinet, while the other sifted through a trunk of books and carved oddities. "Looking for this?" Purbright asked calmly. Both men spun around. Their faces mirrored shock, then fear, then anger in rapid succession. Purbright held the carved fragment between 2 fingers, the first piece Mr. Burroughs hid. "You missed it because you were searching for something dramatic, not something simple." Love tightened his grip on his revolver. Harker shifted uneasily. Mrs. Tegg positioned herself at the doorway with the satisfaction of a woman witnessing justice that had arrived behind schedule but fully dressed. The larger intruder snarled. "Give it here." "Ah," Purbright said softly. "There's the trouble, you see. You demanded this piece. You took Mr. Burroughs when he hesitated. You took Mrs. Tegg when she refused to help. You tried to take the box by force. But you overlooked one thing." He stepped forward, voice as steady as a ticking clock. "You overlooked the town." The men hesitated. "Flaxboro," Purbright continued, "is not built on secrets that survive scrutiny. Every whisper becomes news, every stranger becomes gossip, and every crime, no matter how carefully arranged, disrupts the rhythm of the place." He nodded toward the doorway. Sergeant Love's silhouette filled it, revolver raised with put-upon bravery. "This," Purbright finished softly, "is where your mischief ends." What followed was swift, not violent, but decisive. Love's revolver and Purbright's unwavering composure were enough to disarm both men, who surrendered with the gracelessness of brutes discovering that competence had cornered them. Harker helped bind their hands with rope recovered from Burroughs's stacked trunks. Mrs. Tegg supervised, correcting Harker's knots with the clipped authority of a woman who took pride in tying firm parcels. A short time later, with the men secured and awaiting transport to the station, Purbright stood by the counter where Burroughs had once polished trinkets and overvalued oddments. "Sir," Love asked quietly, "what do you think this fragment really is?" Purbright examined the antique bone piece one last time, letting the carved lines catch the faint light. "A relic," he said softly. "Part of a ceremonial set. Priceless to the sort of men who trade in ancient things they do not understand. Dangerous to those who covet what history meant to keep buried. And Burroughs," Purbright's gaze softened, "a foolish man drawn into a clever trap, and a brave woman." He nodded toward Mrs. Tegg, who refused to let secrets become her burden. Love took a deep breath. "At least we found her alive." "Indeed," Purbright replied. Outside, the rain eased at last, tapering into silence. Flaxboro's ordinary rhythm would resume tomorrow, gossip restored, routines unaltered, and mischief folded back into polite curtains. But a faint unease would linger, the memory of a box, a fragment, an abduction, and a corpse's missing ear. Purbright slipped the fragment into an evidence bag, sealed it, and handed it gently to Love. "We'll let the historians quarrel over it," he said. "Our task is done." Mrs. Tegg, hearing this, lifted her chin. "Inspector, if this ever happens again, I fully expect advance notice." Purbright smiled. I shall keep you informed, Mrs. Tegg. And with that, the quiet world of Flaxboro, the world of ordinary gossip and ordinary respectability, slowly righted itself once more, though it would not forget the cream jug for some time.